That takes me back. Okay, so today, welcome back. Today, we are doing capitalism and sport, the growth of the money game. Okay, so we're picking up kind of where we left earlier in the course, where we talked about this non-linear rise of professionalism. Okay, we looked at how the amateur code came about, how it was challenged, and recall that amateurs were firmly in control until the 1920s, 1930s. And back then, the money game, in fact, was a semi-professional. Uh, Radical changes after World War II, and that's where we're going today, picking up where we left off before, looking at how commercial sport took off to become this multi-billion-dollar industry to this day with massive player salaries and big profits. So buckle your seatbelts, it's going to be quite a ride. First off, we need to remind ourselves that commercial sports did not just take off when professionalism starts to take over. And in fact, in the 1920s, what most people are spending their money on is not on sports, but it is on, the number one thing is on talking pictures, on movies. Talking pictures are invented, really, they come into theaters famously with the movie The Jazz Singer in 1927. And at that point, Hollywood, Tinseltown gains global dominance for the first time. And movies are become the dominant form of entertainment by far in North America. This is where discretionary recreation budget is going. And compare that to sports, it doesn't even come close. So pro semi-hockey, semi-pro hockey revenues annually in that decade is a tiny fraction of theater revenues. Doesn't come close. It's way down there. And the same deal with the 1930s. And guess what comes second in the interwar period? What do Canadians like to spend their hard-earned dollar on after movies? You can probably guess. Yeah, it's drink. It's taverns and bars. So pro hockey way down there. Not a stable time for teams. Now radio, commercial broadcasting of radio, which really begins 1922 in Chicago, that is changing that, and it will change that, as will television more, but which we'll get into. But as of now, that isn't happening. And yes, Canadians, like Americans, are crazy about this new invention of radio broadcasting. It's the first time you can hear a voice from thousands of miles away. This has never happened before. You know, fish in the ether was a popular thing to do, as people did at night with their receiving sets. Listening to sports by radio for the first time, often from several thousand miles away. But the money from radio isn't going to teams yet. And we see that in the number of teams that don't make it in this period, most of which, in fact, will disappear. So dozens of teams are going to fold by 1940. And in fact, between 1917 and 1940, more than 20 NHL teams go under. And you know that. You've learned about the Montreal Wanderers and the Montreal Maroons. And have you ever heard of the Pittsburgh Pirates or the Philadelphia Quakers? All these are gone and many more. Not only that, entire leagues fail. So more leagues fail than make it out of the 1920s. And the 1930s, I should say. Okay, and why is that? Well, so far I'm not telling you much. Well, it helps that you don't know. Well, it helps to know that this is the period that Bruce Kidd describes as the entrepreneurial stage. Okay? Entrepreneurial stage in sports. And it's when different businessmen are creating teams. Guys like Con Jones or Sleeman, town promoters. It's a time of gambling, of challenge events. And in that stage, what these team owners have done is they've already taken that first step towards commercialism. And what is that step? Well, it is the creation of leagues. So this is the entrepreneurial stage. We get the creation of leagues. Now, team owners have learned that this is the best way to make more money, create loyalty with your fans. Leagues are a great way to promote your sport. And we know that. We've looked at that. Now, the problem with the first fledgling leagues, though, is they're really weak. And that's because they're operating in unregulated markets. So these early leagues, whether that's hockey or baseball, they're weak and they disappear almost as fast as they form. And this gets into the whole problem with competition. Competition can be ruinous, and it's the same thing that industrialists had learned in the 19th century. The same thing we saw at about the same time period too in the biggest industry of all back then for several decades, and that's railroads. Okay, railroads used to be very lucrative, but because of that, in fact, they were the number one game for a very long time for investors. But because of that, we get this massive overbuilding by different systems and different companies, both in the States and Canada. The result being that all of them go bankrupt. By the end of World War I, in Canada, all three of the big national rail lines in Canada had gone into receiverships. And in the States, we see a similar problem. So competition is good for the economy. In certain sectors of the economy, though, it's it's potentially ruinous. Okay, and of course, capitalists love capitalism to a point. Ultimately, they would rather not compete. Okay, and that's the great paradox of capitalism. And it's why, in fact, that it really doesn't exist other than in theory. It is always regulated. Okay, human nature, greed operates against our optimal interests. Self-interest encourages everyone to work against each other in unsustainable ways. And that's the problem that has to be solved. And for example, in sports, if several owners agree to form a league, they're cooperating, but up to a point. Okay, they're also adversaries. Right? Each one wants the other teams to lose. So self-interest encourages them to try to buy the best players from other teams. So you get bidding wars. Right? And in 1909, we get our first bidding war in hockey. This is when O'Brien wins out. But he ends up having to pay Cyclone Taylor over $5,000 to play only 12 games. Competition is a problem. It's the great enemy of business, is my point. And it's not just within leagues. You could have competition between leagues. In the early 1900s, there were two hockey leagues competing in Montreal. The result, of course, is not great for either of them. It's divided gate revenues, it's smaller attendance for both leagues. Now, this is why many entrepreneurs lost money and many teams folded in this unregulated atmosphere. Owners had not yet learned that strengthening your league as a whole, maintaining the viability of your league, means also maintaining the viability of other teams within your league, right? That this could work to your advantage. That takes a really long time to learn. Okay? But they do learn that. Owners learn how to strengthen their leagues as a whole. Okay, and this happens in a variety of ways. A few simple measures are adopted that I'm going to look at here. One way this is done is to write contracts between the owners to never sell a player to another league. So if you wanted to release a player from your team, say you want to sell a player in your team, you have to give the other owners in your league a right of first refusal. So these other teams have priority. They have the right to bid on your player. Now this is called waivers. And formally what it means is that releasing a player only after all teams had the opportunity to sign your player. So you can only release after all other teams had the opportunity to sign your player and didn't do that. They didn't jump on that. Now that's a way of balancing the talent pool. It's a way of keeping salaries down, and it's a way of keeping players in your own league. Now, interestingly, the NHL was the first major sports league in North America to do that. That was in 1922, and the NFL is the second. They follow in 1934. Okay? Some long extinct hockey leagues tried this as well. Today, all the major league franchise or sports leagues do this, right? It's all of them use a waiver system, whether it's NFL, NHL, NBA, MLB, and basically what you're doing is you're kind of circling the wagons. You're getting the teams in your league to price fix, so to speak, in order to limit competition. So the leagues are closed. They don't play other leagues or other teams. They're exclusive. And of course, that means you need a franchise to play to join a league, and new teams that join, their owners pay that franchise fee to join. So you know all this, but the thing is, it's not inevitable. That is the North American model, and there are other models, okay? Like British soccer. In British soccer, the leagues are open. So, and maybe you know this, that the lower league clubs, the lower level clubs can move up a league, or they can be sent down. And in British soccer too, the money goes mainly to the players. Where in North American sports traditionally, the owners got as much or more than the players. Now, what all this means is this model here, the waiver model, is you're moving toward becoming a cartel. A cartel. And the interesting thing is cartels, which are really trusts, they're known to be a negative. Right, so much so that they became illegal in the late 19th century in the USA and in Canada. And in fact, probably nobody knows this, and I didn't know this for a long time, even though I taught US and American history, that Canada was the world leader in making these illegal. Okay? Here we have an anti-competition law called the Anti-Combines Act already in 1889. So that is the world's first, the Anti-Combines Act 1889. It is the world's first industrial era antitrust statute, anti-combines legislation. Okay? And again, trust is simply another word for cartel. The U.S. follows that a year later with a much more well-known Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And probably much more well known because Teddy Roosevelt famously uses this to break up Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil, and he goes against J.P. Morgan and all the robber barons of his time, breaking up, well, not all of them. He thinks there's good trust and bad trust, anyway, more than you need to know. But he's going after monopolies, right, to save capitalism from itself, basically. Okay, so the alternative to the cartel model exists. There was in sport as well, and that is the syndicate. Okay, so that is the main alternative to the cartel model that becomes dominant. Now, the syndicate really isn't seen anymore, but it used to be. And you've learned about the Patrick families, right? Pacific Coast Hockey Association. That's the best example. So this is founded in 1912. It's a pro league owned by Joe Patrick and his sons Lester and Frank. And in this, all the teams are under a unified management, which is themselves. And they built their own arenas even. They owned all three teams, all three initial teams, and then they added three more in the United States. And they even got to the point where they're rating players from the future NHL, the NHA, right up until they can't compete anymore and their teams start to fold one by one. And then finally they join another league, the WCHL. Then a couple of years later they sell out to the NHL. And they sold Portland players to the NHL expansion team in Chicago and the Victoria team to the expansion team in Detroit at the end, which is kind of cool. And that's the original Red Wings, or the old Victoria Cougars. But in any case, that's another common tack, okay, is at the time, back then, the syndicate, not seen anymore. Another one is the merger. Okay, and that's a common way back in the day to further limit competition, and that's just what we saw here with the NHL taking over the PCHA. Okay, and the merger, buy out your competition, and that's especially common in the era of consolidation. A really big one for the NHL being that year, 1926, when they buy out the Patricks. But mainly, really, what you want to know, the name of the game is cartels. Leagues are becoming cartels. They limit who can have a team, and they limit where those teams can be. They limit competition for athletes. They limit competition by other leagues, all of which is illegal in any other industry. Now, what's really fascinating about this is that for reasons that are not entirely clear, and we have to put them down to cultural, is that sports leagues have been exempted from antitrust legislation historically in North America. So you can legally restrict opportunities for players to play for the team of their choice. Now, this was most recently made clear in a decision in 2021, and that's the Supreme Court decision, Moore versus the National Hockey League. So this is a former player, Kobe Moore, who sues NHL and the minor league system, $825 million, for specifically for limiting his opportunities and other player opportunities. Okay, so good on you. He's only 21, and by this point he's played for 5 years. He's played for the Western Hockey League, for the Oil Kings, for Kamloops, and for Moose Jaw. So he sues the Western Hockey League, he sues their parent league, the CHL, he sues the Quebec Major Junior League and the Ontario Hockey League and the NHL, so everyone, the 3 Canadian junior hockey leagues and the NHL, the whole system. And his simple complaint is that the leagues are in an unlawful conspiracy to limit opportunities for Canadians to make a decent living playing hockey. Now, and he lost, okay? So the court clarified in this case that the Competition Act does not apply to interleague agreements. So the NHL can conspire all it wants with, say, the Canadian Hockey League, i.e. it can pay them a nominal fee to keep their players as their development pool and keep those players from signing with another league. Okay, so denied. So the NHL is a legal cartel, which should be an oxymoron. But in any case, that's how it was formed. And that's really the story of this one ruthless bastard, Frank Calder. Nobody was better at this game than this guy, Frank Calder. And it explains why the NHL lasts and how it came to dominate where others folded. And recall, there had been more than a dozen leagues in Canada by the 1920s. Okay, so Calder is born in England. He comes to Canada, becomes a sports reporter in Montreal, and then eventually is president of the NHL. And what he does initially, genius, is persuades the other owners to accept the waiver rule. Okay, big moment. Then he imposes a reserve clause. Okay, now this is something he borrowed from pro baseball. Basically, it binds a player to the team they sign with. But here's the thing, not just for the term of the contract, even after it has expired. Okay? So the player is bound to the team he signs in perpetuity. Okay? Insanity. Or, right, he can play for another team only with his own team's permission, okay, with the say-so of his team owners that he originally signs with. Now, clearly, this makes the player a form of bound labor. He has no freedom of movement, has no ability to bargain, okay? Has no agency. The other thing he did is he managed to get anti-rating agreements with other leagues, and with these rival leagues that are rapidly disappearing in his time. Now, rating agreements, they kind of shore up the reserve clause because they specify a period of time has to elapse before a released player can play for another league. So it's on that team with the reserve clause to release that player. But then the rating agreement says that it has to be a period of time before that player can play for another league. Another method he tries and doesn't really succeed in so well are those two in red there, which is player sharing and revenue sharing. So, for example, 1920 to 21, Calder tries to insist that the champion team donate a few players to the weakest team. But the champion team that first year, the Senators, they simply refused. Okay, so that died right there. Another form, this will kind of be reiterated in draft rules later on, and of course the idea being equity between teams and better competition. Revenue sharing was also tried in the 20s. The visiting team, and it succeeds. The visiting team only gets 3.5% of the gate revenues, but it succeeds eventually, not initially. Okay? Now, 3.5% of the gate revenues for the visiting team is nothing, but Calder cannot get the richer teams to change that formula at this point. Okay, he has better luck with the salary cap. Okay? 1925, he gets all teams on side with not spending more than $35K a year on salaries, $35,000. That lasts a few years, and eventually by the early 40s, that's mid 40s, it's up to about 65, 70,000. But really, it's not needed at this point because the reserve clause already works at keeping salaries down. Okay. The point being, by using these methods and succeeding in most of them, Calder and the NHL emerges as the only pro hockey league. Okay? And as of 1931, it becomes the only league to contend for the Stanley Cup. All the other leagues have folded, or they're now effectively minor leagues. And that's really because Calder was the best at forming this powerful cartel. All right, he's the best at this game, and yeah, the NHL dominated, unchallenged, pretty much from then till now, with that one blip in the 1970s that we're about to talk about. Now, the result of NHL domination has not all been bad. It's been mixed, and on the one side there is stability, right, which matters a lot in sports. So usually most teams have most often made a profit, okay, and that matters for continuity. And with that as well, we get this reliable, exciting, competitive hockey, and it went on for generations, right? Generations of Canadians have enjoyed this really fantastic popular spectacle, and it's one that we could rely on. And you know what? If you watch the People's History of Hockey series, that's kind of where they would leave it, right? The good story. But there's also another side, and it's a really significant one, and this will connect with you. And it's the main thing here is the point I want to make is that for the league to be as profitable as possible, it limited itself to the best markets. So from the outset, it really mirrored this regional concentration of power in Canada. By which I mean central Canada at the expense of the rest, okay? The east at the expense of the west and everywhere else. So the NHL is essentially an octopus. That's how you might see it, as an octopus that's drawing talent from all corners of the land into what eventually settles as 6 major urban centers, all in the east. Okay? Montreal, New York, Boston, Detroit, Chicago, Toronto, right? Even Ottawa couldn't have a team. The original Ottawa Senators fold, and then they're gone. Okay, they move south. Secondly, the best players, in order to play, they are leaving their hometowns, they're leaving their provinces, or even leaving Canada. So the 1920s, you see the beginning of the Americanization of NHL hockey. Right? This is when, for the first time, U.S. teams outnumber Canadian teams, and famously, even the Hamilton Tigers, they moved to New York, become the New York Rangers, and as I said, the Ottawa Senators are gone. And as we saw already, the last two PWHA teams that sold to the NHL both go to the States as well. Okay? Now, the legacy of all this is this weird phenom where we created this great sport, where Canadians still are the dominate in terms of the numbers of players, as you can see there in this graph. Less so today than they were before, but still. Uh, create this great sport where we are alienated from it because at the highest level, most of it is being played in another country and controlled by their markets and their deeper pockets. And you see that most vividly when every year in the playoffs, when Canadian teams get winnowed out, and as that happens, Canadian interests and audiences start to drop off in tandem with that, right? And sometimes, like in 2016, there are no playoff games north of the border. Canadians are completely shut out. Or, more typically, there's just one or two teams from Canada in the final round. Right? Or often happens, like in 2020, no Canadian teams in the final round. So in that year, the Cup finals ended up being played in Tampa Bay and Las Vegas. Both cities where only a minority know or really care about hockey. So yeah, thank God for Edmonton. Bringing us back consistently to the finals, or somewhat consistently anyways. But yeah, that interest level drops off as the Canadian teams fall away, and that's a function of this Americanization of the game. Absolutely. Now, the third point I want to draw your attention to in this lecture, and the whole wider story of NHL domination and the big money game, relates to the players as employees, which we've gotten into a bit, so let's dive in there a bit more. Now, because the league is a successful cartel for most of the 20th century, players are in a terrible position for most of the 20th century. They're in this brutal, despotic labor management system in which they're pretty much completely impotent. Now, the crux of that is they are unprotected because Canadian courts don't see them as wage employees. And wage employees with the limited rights that employees had back in the day in the post-war period, including the right to form a union. Instead, they're seen as independent contractors, which means ineligible for unionization. And the men who ran the NHL, they knew this and they took full advantage of that. And you see that in a couple ways. You see that in the fact that, one, they're not paid very much, even by the standards of the time. So in 1950, the average player salary is $5,000. Okay, now that's not terrible. The average salary in Canada, and interestingly in the States, is about $3,000. The States is slightly more. Now the interesting thing too is that the Canadian and US dollars are on par, so we can talk about them both the same way. In fact, the Canadian dollar is higher than the American greenback for most of the 1950s. Okay, so 5,000 for hockey players, average 3,000 NHL, 3,000 for all workers. And that's what matters. It is all workers in North America. So it's working class to professional. So essentially that means that the standard of living of players is really no different than that of most of their middle class fans, okay? And certainly less than the doctors and lawyers, the professionals that are coming to their games. Also, their careers are much shorter. Their pensions are also almost nil. So you have a short career with really almost no pension. The assumption there is a very old one, that you'll be finding another career after playing hockey, which is really not great if you started playing right out of high school and you don't have something to easily fall back on. And a key point, a really key point here, is they don't know what the salaries are of their teammates because there's no transparency here. There's no transparency in salaries, so they don't know what others are getting paid, and that is used to massive advantage by their owners. So they basically have no rights. Owners could do anything. If you try to organize a union, you would be blacklisted and traded away. Okay? And now the wider context here is this is the Conn Smythe Norris family era. Okay, so let's look at these people a minute. Conn Smythe, huge legacy. He really built the league. He built that temple to Canadian hockey, the Maple Leaf Gardens. He coached the Maple Leafs to multiple Stanley Cups. He's the owner of the Leafs for an astounding 34 years, from 1927 to 1961. Okay, so he's also known though as being pretty belligerent. And he's absolutely super controlling. His players are not allowed to do anything outside of hockey, and in fact, players are required to work in his gravel business off season. He even famously kept one player in the minor leagues for years as punishment for getting married without permission. That's the level of control that he has, Conn Smythe. Now, Smythe is in tight with James Norris, and Norris is the head of the Norris family, which owns most of the NHL teams. Okay? It owns 3 of the 4 American teams throughout the 50s and 60s, and has a big interest in the 4th. Okay, so James Norris Sr., he had first bought the Detroit Red Wings in 1932, and the family owns it right till 1982, so for 50 years. And he and his sons and his daughter, they end up having controlling shares in the Chicago Blackhawks, the New York Rangers, significant share in the Boston Bruins, and the Detroit Red Wings, obviously, as I said, and they own Madison Square Gardens. Okay? And in fact, the original 6 year of 1942 to 67 is often called the Norris House League years, the NHL Norris House League, that signify their level of control because it's that absolute. And they're also, not incidentally, rabidly anti-union. And if you try and organize, you are in for it, as Ted Lindsay finds out, which we'll get into. Clearly, concentration of ownership means that these guys can do as they please. There's no competition, so the players, they're treated as pawns. Now, rounding out this little group is NHL President Clarence Campbell, Edmonton's own. He's a longtime referee, then NHL executive, where he's also at the helm for over 30 years. So these guys have incredibly long tenures. He too anti-union, and he sides with his owner friends in any dispute. Okay, so best known probably for suspending Maurice Richard and triggering the 1955 riots in Montreal. And those riots kind of are symbolic of what he's about. He's very used to it, and he's willing to use his power, both against the wishes of players and even of the fan base. Okay? So yeah, basically that's the story. Where Smythe, Norris, and Campbell, they're free to exploit players in this period, and they do. Right? They're keeping as much of the gate as possible, as much of the revenue as possible for themselves, in a context in which it's a pretty healthy revenue streams, and it's making them richer and richer. And that wider context being television, which we'll get into in a bit. So the Smythe Norris Campbell ring, they know they're underpaying, and a great example of that is a famous story of Gordie Howe, right? Gordie Howe, one of hockey's superstars. So yes, he makes more than average, and every year in the 1960s, he's getting a $1,000 raise. By 1968, he's at $50,000. Okay? Now, the average Canadian in 1968 is making close to $10,000. So yes, he's doing significantly better than that, but certainly nothing compared to where what he should be pulling in, given what he's bringing to his organization. Now, in that same year, 1968, he finds out that his teammate, Bob Bond, is making $17,000 more than him. Again, without transparency of salaries, you don't know. He hears this rumor, finds out it's true. Now, Bob Bond is good, but Howe is a generational player. So he goes and he asks Bruce Norris for a raise, and Norris doubles his salary, okay, from $50,000 to $100,000. Now, and so here's how. He's a conservative guy. He's not demanding, but this is crazy. He says to Norris, I've been playing for you for 22 seasons. Why only now am I getting paid what I'm worth? And Norris, his answer is quote, Gordie, you never asked. I'm a businessman, right? So that's really what it comes down to. No respect for what he has given his team. And what he's given Norris over the years. And the fact is, with the reserve clause, Norris didn't even have to do this. Howe never had free agency. So yeah, the movie Net Worth, that's about exactly this era. It's a definitely you want to watch. Right away you'll recognize this as a dated movie. It's an oldie. It has low production values for sure, but it gives you a really good sense of this period. And the focus of the story is that showdown between Ted Lindsay and Jack Adams, who finally have had enough and they fight back against this. Now, Adams, there's another name we need to introduce you to. He's the face of the NHL in the movie, which is a face for radio, as they say. He is general manager of Detroit. And yes, he was with Detroit as coach and then GM for 36 years. This is that theme with all these guys. Okay, 36 years. And yeah, Jack Adams, amazing. He built this farm system that produced some of the best NHL players ever, including Howe. He led Detroit to 7 regular season firsts in a row, along with 4 Stanley Cups. Right, but there's always a flip side to that kind of endurance, and he's really an old-time enforcer. And in fact, his nickname is Trader Jack because he likes to keep his players insecure. Nobody is beyond being traded for stepping out of line, as Ted Lindsay famously does so. And he is the film's protagonist, Ted Lindsay. Now, Lindsay is a 9-time NHL All-Star. He's a real pit bull. He's a short, tough guy from Renfrew, Ontario, which is, I call it that because it's apt. He's called Terrible Ted. Okay. Any case, so he, along with Doug Harvey of Montreal, they get this small group together to fight the Norris Campbell machine. And they're going to do that by forming an association, forming a union. So get united against the owners and the president. Now, as he does, players involved with him get exactly the kind of backlash you'd expect. They end up getting benched or they get sent down to the minors for supporting organization. So, any case, not above dirty tricks. Jack Adams spreads false rumors about Lindsay, and he also even shows reporters in a press scrum a completely fake contract of Lindsay, as if he's making 25,000 a year. At the point, he was being paid 12,000. So. Pretty incredible. Any case, Lindsay files a lawsuit against the league, an antitrust lawsuit, in response to this blowback. Uh, and that's kind of the precursor to this more recent effort by Kobe Moore. Anyway, the suit alleges that the league, because Lindsay has found out a lot more, and the suit alleges that the league is illegally hiding revenues, and that this goes back to the 1920s, to the Frank Calder years. And it was true. Evidence that later comes out of this is that the teams were keeping two sets of books, which is the classic mafia move, right? One set for internal accurate tracking, the other for tax inspectors. They're hiding their revenues, and they're hiding revenues in everything from concession sales to parking and even to ticket sales, right? They're also lying to players about what's in the player pension fund, which they're actually in a lot of years not even putting any money into. Any case, response to the lawsuit, Adams is given the go-ahead to demote Lindsay from team captain, and then he trades him to Chicago. Okay? But the Norrises are afraid. Okay? They're not wanting a trial where potentially they can be exposed, and really what they're engaging in is criminal activity. So the owners cave and they settle out of court. And they allow this association. So to avoid the spotlight, they settle out of court. They allow a players' association union, and then promptly fight tooth and nail to destroy it, and successfully, because it doesn't last very long. It lasts a couple years, but it is a first step, and this is the start of what will be the NHLPA, the NHL Players Association, that union, 10 years later. So change is on the way. Positive change. And you see it in another big story from 1957, which happens in Montreal, where the Molson's company buys the Montreal Canadiens. The Molson's company gets the Habs, along with the Montreal Forum. Now, this is the era of Jacques Plante, Maurice Richard, Jean Beliveau, and what the Molsons do is they confirm Toe Blake as coach. He's been in a couple of years now, and that makes sense. They want this guy. They've just won 2 Stanley Cups in a row with Toe Blake. He will turn out to be the most winning coach in Habs history, with 8 Stanley Cups, 5 in a row, starting with his first year on the bench. And his record is second only to Scotty Bowman, but he's first in terms of single team cup wins. So yeah, it's quite the team and quite the coach. But the bigger point, very cool period, but the bigger point is this ownership shift signals a wider shift, which is the expansion of corporate capitalism into sports and sports ownership. In the first half of the 20th century, team ownership is mainly families. They often own small businesses or companies, and sometimes not even that, right? In the 20s, the New York Americans were owned by a bootlegger, Bill Dwyer, who had to borrow from one of his players to keep the team afloat. But he managed, in spite of that, to buy a second NHL team and some football teams. So that's the kind of era we've come out of. But that's nothing, says you. John Spano famously bought the New York Islanders with 0 money to his name. If you don't know that story, great documentary on that. Do look it up. In any case, that's not important. What I'm talking about is this big shift starting in the 1950s and 60s towards big companies owning sports franchises, and especially those in beer or communications. So Molson's in Montreal, right? They own it for a long time, sell it, and then get it back again. It's on and off with that family for that family corporation for a few times. Carleen O'Keefe will own the Nordiques, which is later bought by Comsat Video and then moved to Colorado. Labatt's will own the Blue Jays, and later Rogers will. So that's a tendency. And the purpose for this new breed of owner is not just to make a profit from the team. It's mainly about supporting the corporation, because it is promotion, it's advertising, it's a way of being seen as providing this public benefit, giving something to the city, to the fans, right? And it's also a tax benefit, and a pretty huge one, because roster depreciation allowance means that a team that's in the black can report huge losses. Okay, so and the purchase price of the team itself is a 15-year tax deduction. Okay. So yeah, corporate ownership is one big change, and the other is the shift to television, okay? Television broadcasting. So broadcasting in Canada really begins before Canadian television exists. It's one of the oddities of Canada being on the border with the States. The advent of broadcast television, regular programming, is 1952 in Canada. And from the outset, hockey is the most popular viewing, Hockey Night in Canada. Shortly after that, a month after broadcasting begins, we get the CBC TV launch of Hockey Night in Canada, the transition from radio and the same sponsor, Imperial Oil. Okay, just as it had been on CBC radio. Now, Americans are running ahead of us, as I said. So NBC, RCA, they'd already been regularly broadcasting television programming since 1939, since just before World War II. So from 1939 to 52, Canadians were buying these big antennas, putting them on the roof, and were tuning into these cross-border signals. And yeah, about 100,000 TV sets were sold already before 1952. Any case, so 1948, here's a great quote there by from Piers, who is the historian about broadcasting in Canada, and he talks about Torontonians crowding around this barroom set to watch the World Series. Very cool. By 1952, as I said, 100,000 televisions, but 4 years later, 6 out of 10 homes in Canada have a television. Okay, and it's a massive game changer because the revenues from this are exponentially higher. So now you can have larger arenas, you can have higher ticket prices, a much bigger money game with television. And just to reinforce that, media rights really become an increasingly big piece of the pie. While radio and newspaper revenues still exist, but they fall off a cliff now, really. Media rights become an ever increasingly big piece of the pie. And great example, 2025, Rogers inked a second 12-year deal for national media rights on all Canadian platforms of the NHL, and the agreement is to pay US 7.7 billion, roughly 11 billion Canadian, for that. This is more than double the 5.2 billion that Rogers agreed to pay in 2013. And didn't always do the greatest job of, but or definitely have improved. Now, the interesting thing is in the States for a very long time, there's this huge untapped potential because in fact, there are no regular season broadcasting. There is no regular season broadcasting of the NHL until the 1990s when Fox starts that. Fox, and that later becomes Disney and Turner Sports who contract for those rights. That's as of 2021. Disney being ABC and ESPN. And Turner Sports being TNT and TBS, which maybe is more information than you want or need. And yeah, it's hard to keep up with mergers. Eventually, there's just I'm convinced there's just going to be one mega media empire called maybe Amazon. Anyway, tough to keep up. Definitely concentration is the name of the game. But yeah, in the States now they're getting 625 million annually. Okay, so. Interesting thing for me there is that all that U.S. media revenue, which is obviously far more teams, is only about the same as the income from Canada alone because we're just so hockey crazy here. Okay, but altogether between the two, it is a lot. It's more than $1 billion a year media rights, and what's incredible to consider too, if you take a wider lens of that, is there a poor cousin when it comes to Major League Sports? This is by far the lowest TV revenue as a ratio of Major League Sports in North America. Okay? I think with NFL is over 11 or up to 12 billion per year. Any case, another point is that the gate and the TV revenues complement each other. So we get ever increasing level in gate sales in tandem with the rise of television broadcasting. And yeah, again, it builds on itself. It allows for expansion. And media is a huge part of why the average operating income for the NHL has been quite healthy. And about, by the 2020s, about 70 million per team per year. Okay, so more corporate ownership, in turn television, both big game changers, both mean more money is being spent, being made. Third change in the post-war period, and this gets back to our discussion about players versus management, is changing labor laws. Okay? More and more players have agency, and literally agency. And this is a function of, again, changes in labor law. Now, what allowed Ted Lindsay to do what he did is the simple fact that Canadians had won the right to collective bargaining in the Second World War. Now, if you don't know what that means, it's what unions have been fighting for since forever, since the 19th century, since unions formed. Right? And it means basically that if a majority in an industry vote for a union, then that union has the right to represent anyone, everyone, right? And workers must join, even those who didn't vote for it. Now, for a long time, this is viewed as illegal. It was considered, quote, a combination and restraint of trade in court decisions. And so in the official language of the Canadian courts, this is a combination and restraint of trade. And U.S. courts, same deal. So courts treated unions as criminal conspiracies and because they restricted free labor competition. Now, and interesting, that comes under those same anti-competition acts, that unions are struck down over those, even though they were really aimed at industries, okay, as being illegal trusts. Anyway, the Americans are well ahead of us in overturning that and in recognizing collective bargaining for workers. And they did that with the Wagner Act of 1935. That's where collective bargaining is recognized and workers in America have the right to organize unions. Huge shift in requiring employers to recognize a union that are voted on by a majority, right? Which is collective bargaining. So that, this happens in America well ahead of Canada, and it happens in Canada during World War II for reasons maybe you can figure out. Labor has a huge advantage in World War II. Okay? We have zero unemployment. Every worker and then some is needed for a total war economy geared to defeating the Axis, right? And because of that, and coming out of the Great Depression, you have these laborers that are trying to make up for lost time. You get a whole lot of labor agitation. The strike now is very, very powerful because no man hours can be lost during the war, or women hours, and many women are working too. Everyone is conscripted in labor. So yeah, in response, workers win this temporary government measure. It was supposed to be temporary, which is the right to collective bargaining in PC 1003. Now, after the war, it ends up getting extended by a couple of years and eventually becomes permanent. Okay? And it becomes the Industrial Relations and Dispute Act, a permanent fixture in Canadian labor law. Okay? So that means that the obstructionism of the NHL is really illegal in this post-war context. Okay? But only if players are understood to be workers, and that's always the debate. Yeah. In any case, which the courts have to decide on and will. Now, another change is we get a new generation of athlete, which mirrors kind of the cultural change overall. Okay? In the post-war period, more players are like Ted Lindsay than had been before. More players are more educated and have more capacity. You have mostly now they've graduated high school at least, and more of them are going to college, and more of them are middle class. Okay? So we have players who have the capacity to challenge for their rights in a changing culture where more and more people are becoming educated and middle class. So we see the rise of the educated athlete. Okay? And probably no better symbol of that is Ken Dryden, who actually becomes a lawyer while playing for Montreal. Now, the fourth change that happens is the NHL finally sees some much needed competition. Okay? The NHL had effectively bullied the trustees of the Stanley Cup into making it an NHL-only prize. Right? They had blacklisted the competing league in 1931, the AHL. The AHL had challenged for the Cup for the last time, and Frank Calder persuaded the trustees of the Cup that the AHL was some outlaw league. The NHL would basically become proprietors of the Cup going forward. Right, and the interesting thing is Frank Calder did this, but he's such a bastard. He said he would, the NHL would forfeit the cup going forward rather than accept a challenge from this other league. Okay? And that's because he hated the AHL because they had teams in competing markets, specifically in Chicago and in Buffalo. So Calder ended up getting his way, and the Stanley Cup became de facto NHL property, and it has been since 1931. The AHL withered away. But now here we have it, it's 1972, and we get the World Hockey Association. Okay? The first real competition to NHL since the 1930s. Okay? So pretty great. And the WHA is the brainchild of two American businessmen. Right? And the idea is a 10-team league. It ends up being 12, and it's a league without reserve clauses, so much more enticing for players to sign, but also because they're paying double what the NHL is paying, right? So in its first year, it managed to sign almost 70 players from the NHL. Now, according to the NHL rules, this is stealing, right? Because it goes against their reserve clause. So they're stealing about 70 players, right? Interestingly, the least theft of players comes from Montreal and Toronto, because at the time they're the ones that are able to pay higher salaries with their higher TV revenues. But the WHA definitely is a threat. Okay, they're aggressively scouting in the NHL. They're aggressively scouting in Europe as well, so they're competing there, which is a growing thing. They're also going after 18 to 20-year-olds, because at that time you had to be 20 to be drafted in the NHL. And because of that, the NHL will change that 2 years later. They have to meet the competition here, but mostly it's the simple fact that they're paying double the NHL wages. Okay? Really big moment for the legitimacy of the WHA when they famously signed Bobby Hull for $1 million for a 10-year contract, which was unheard of at the time, plus a $250,000 bonus per year. Now, the average NHL salary that year was $25,000. Okay? More importantly, Hull is the best NHL forward at that time. So this is a really big blow, especially to the Blackhawks, Hull's team, who immediately took him to court in response for that, for negating his compulsory contract and reserve clause. They then get Derek Sanderson for $2.6 million, even more. So for this really weird brief time, Derek Sanderson of the NHL is the highest paid athlete in the world, higher than Hank Aaron, the famous baseball player who just signed a contract that same year, okay, which had made Aaron one of the highest in baseball, but for far less than Sanderson. Okay, now these inflated salaries is really what would eventually kill the WHA, and in fact they can't keep this up. But they certainly managed to offend the NHL. Many of their teams are in the same markets as NHL teams brilliantly, though they're also going after these mid-level cities that had long been ignored by the NHL, like Winnipeg, like Quebec, and like Edmonton. And of course, nothing upsets the NHL owners more than this competition. Right? They haven't had any for decades, right? And they take it personal, which is the fascinating thing, right? And you see that in the fact that these NHL owners are vehemently opposed to merger talks. As the WHA starts to seek that, because they're not so viable after a few years, but the owners are opposed to talks because they take it so personally. What the WHA had done to ruin hockey in Canada was how they saw it, because of this inflation of player salaries. So you really see the arrogance of the NHL in their decision not to allow Hull or any WHA player to represent Canada in the 72 Summit Series. And they simply do that simply because they can, okay? And they're pissed off. Okay? So reaction of the NHL to the WHA, in fact, was to sue them. They go to court to get an injunction against this new upstart league. So they take them to court for theft of players for not respecting the NHL reserve clause, which is not a great plan, as it turns out, because they not only lose, but this court, and it's a court in America, it rejects this attempt at an injunction, but also goes one further, and it's a really big one further, because it's at this point that this court strikes down the NHL reserve clause. And it says that it's this long overdue decision, really. It says that the reserve clause is an illegal monopolistic practice. It is completely ultraveres legal protections for free labor that have been in existence since the 1930s. So really, it's a beautiful story where the NHL brings it on themselves, right? Through this court case, they think they're going to win, and in fact, they lose in a significant way they could not have foreseen. So now players are suddenly free agents. Okay, and yeah, that is huge. Nothing is more consequential for the shift in power and in income for the end of this despotic labor relations than this. Okay, or for a more equitable division of these ever increasing revenues at this time. Okay, so the WHA is really this reckoning moment for the NHL. And as I said, it doesn't last. It folds and goes for this buyout merger that sees four of its teams continue in the National Hockey League, and that's the Oilers, the Nordiques, the Jets, and the New England Whalers. Now, a few reasons that they fold. The main is their salaries. They can't stay in the black, paying these big salaries. But also it's old NHL names like Harold Ballard, who now is out of jail, and he's really making life hard for them in Toronto, where they try and have a second team, and it's this kind of thing. Okay, so it's these old NHL guys that are conspiring against the WHA, and so there's a bigger story here if you're interested in exploring that. And both the NHL and Hockey Canada at the time are really conspiring to conserve the exclusivity of the game under the NHL banner. Meantime, as I said, NHL players finally have a union since 1967. That's when the NHL PA launches and becomes established for good. So a few years after Ted Lindsay's original one folded under pressure tactics, right? Executive director, unfortunately, of the NHLPA is Canada's own Alan Eagleson, who's a lawyer, promoter, and agent for about 350 players, including Bobby Orr. And like many other players' agents, he has sticky fingers. This is why it's unfortunate. He steals millions of dollars from the players' pension fund. Now, the wider context here, Eagleson is always a friend of the owners more than the players, and you see that in his role in keeping the WHA out of the Summit Series, which he took a central role in organizing a few months into the planning process. He didn't start at that, began at the diplomatic level, but he's instrumental there, and instrumental in keeping the WHA out of that series. But yes, for a long period of time, he's stealing from players, and he ruins players like Orr, bankrupts them because of that. So afterward, for a long time, players are getting very little by way of pension, given what he did. He also embezzled Canada Cup proceeds. And he's the choose your adjective, who didn't want to let the Soviets take that cup back with them when they won it. He also gives a middle finger to Soviet fans in 1972, but then he gets fingered in a different way, namely by one player who, with his wife, spent about 20 years gathering evidence on him. They get a reporter on it, and in 1990, the FBI follows up. Finally, in 1994, he is charged with 34 counts of fraud, racketeering, and embezzlement. Charged a lot faster in the States than in Canada. The RCMP are very slow to charge him. 3 years later, in fact. But you can't blame them. They had nothing on him, nothing to go on. Apparently, their toilet was broken. Any case, the players win a settlement of $40 million against him, and he spends 6 months in the slammer. He's disbarred, and yeah. And it casts that light on the fact that players historically always have been very easy to take advantage of. And here we have just more of the same by the guy who's supposed to be a sign of changing times. So super unfortunate. Now, forgive me for bringing this up, but you might be catching a theme here of NHL criminality. And yes, I put this into Google. What franchise has most owners with criminal history? And wow, look what popped up. The NHL definitely has more than its share of self-promoting criminals, embezzlers, and just out-and-out douchebags. Now, of course, this is not empirical evidence of much. It could well be in that Major League Baseball or football has more of that as a ratio. This really reflects the fact that somebody out there has taken it upon themselves to quantify a list of all the criminals in NHL history. But not to say these are all exactly that, but fraud definitely is a continuing theme. And amazingly, when to me, because I was thinking about how the BlackBerry Rim owner, Jim Balsillie, tried to buy the Phoenix Coyotes in 2009, and he tried to buy many teams over the years, never successful. But Gary Bettman and the NHL board said no, and allegedly they invoked a clause in their policies and procedures about owners must have good moral character and integrity. So, but in fact, they talked about markets and not wanting market competition against Toronto and Buffalo. But in any case, Balsillie, though, they just offended by him because he's not playing according to their rules. Okay, but he's really not even close to these others, not even in the same league. Pun completely intended. Okay, so with that loss in the American court, with the loss of the reserve clause, with having to match the WHA for a few years, we start seeing these big player contracts that the league can now afford given the big media revenues, to the point that the average salary goes from under 100,000 in 1980 to 3.5 million by 2026. So, and you maybe know that since the last lockout strike, there's a revenue sharing agreement with the owners. Of course, there's also transparency over salaries. We all know what they're making. But these guys, and here's the point I want to end with, is that these guys, the 700 something on the NHL rosters, they're the winners. They made it, and in fact, they're really the one percenters. Okay, so, but which gets at whether the days of exploitation are behind us, because it certainly feels that way when our lenses focus on these star players and their massive contracts. But what happens in sports, as I've said so many times, reflects what happens in culture. And the fact is, there's only so big of a pie. There's only so much money for hockey. It's finite, right? And it's much more finite in hockey than it is in other professional sports. In spite of these what we see as massive salaries, they're a fraction of what athletes are getting in the other major leagues. In any case, as elite athletes take more and more, the gap between them and other pro players, who we seldom think about, really has become a chasm. And we see that in all North American sports. Okay? So the average NFL salary, when it reached about 4 million, the CFL salary was still under 100,000. Okay, so now the CFL is not a development league for the NFL, but it certainly is considered that semi-pro football. NBA average, once it reached about 12 million, was 300 times the NBA development league salary. Okay? And you see the same thing in hockey, in the ECHL, in the AHL, and the others. They make a tiny fraction of the NHL rosters. Now, this didn't used to be the case. And in this, sports mirrors what's happening in the broader culture at exactly the same time. Okay? So starting in the late 70s, that broad middle class starts to narrow. Okay? As this post-war broad middle class starts to get narrower, as the share of income for the richest North Americans gets bigger and bigger. And you've heard this story before. Now, as with pro salaries, this is offset quite a bit by progressive taxation, and we tend to forget that. But as you see in the top right chart here, that is really the more significant chart because it accounts for taxation. But the rise of the 1% is in tandem with those at the other end having less and less a share of the pie. And we have that in the broader culture. We also have it in sports. Okay, so pro athletes of the major leagues, they're the one percenters, and all other athletes are kind of checking the hours at the local food bank. Now, without going into too much detail, but I thought it was necessary maybe to explain a bit of this. This supply side economics, the idea is to leave more money in the hands of the rich. They'll stimulate the economy, they'll trickle down into benefits for all. Supply side trickle down economics, or Reaganomics, whatever you want to call it, right? Basically a 30-year experiment that ends in about 2012, interestingly. And since then, things have reversed again. but not to the point they were of the 1970s. We still have a much higher inequality today than we did before. But that bottom left chart should give you some hope. Since 2012 in Canada, anyway, the growth of income among the bottom 20% is much higher than it is among the wealthiest. Okay, but we are left with this legacy of the top percent having benefited enormously from from this 30-year period of declining equality. Okay, because of supply side economics. Now, the point is, inequality among paid athletes reflects these trends in the wider culture. So the hockey elite, just like the NBA, just like the NFL, they get stupid rich. Most pro athletes are making almost nothing. And that's whether it's boxing, lacrosse, rugby, NBA Development League, all the rest of it. In fact, minor league ball players have launched lawsuits in the United States that their pay violates federal minimum wage laws, which, if you know much about the states, you know those are very low. Okay, or that a wage is very low. Now, recall it wasn't this way before. In the golden age of semi-pro leagues, you could make a decent living as a ball player in dozens of small towns in Canada and in the Midwest United States. In North America, semi-pro athletes and teams were far more common in the early and into the mid-20th century than they are today because of that. And it's a fact. Consider this: Kobe Bryant made $25 million a year when he died tragically in 2020. Okay, NBA Development League players that year averaged 35,000. So it would have taken 714 NBA Development League players, I did the math, to make what Kobe Bryant made in his single last year. Right? You can take the same math to hockey. Right? As of 2026, the average annual pay for an AHL hockey player was 61,000. That's the best of the best. All right. In case you need a simple salary calculator, that's $29.60 an hour. So in any case, it would take a combined income of 270 AHL players to make what Leon Draisaitl made in 2025. Okay. ECHL, they make less. At the bottom of the pile, Quebec's LNAH. Right, so in these semi-pro leagues, such as the Quebec League, players are earning maybe 150 to 400 a game. And often with teams that are operating under these really strict and often stagnant salary caps per game. So what happens then too is these semi-pro minor league players, they often make more money in Europe than they do in North America, where they still are semi-pro are paid more. And where we didn't have that massive turn towards Reaganomics that we had here in North America, definitely not on the continent. In Europe, lower tier leagues frequently offer better compensation. They'll offer free housing, vehicles, paid flights, and all the rest. So in any case, very low salaries in the semi-pros, and compared to the NHL minimum salary, which hits $1 million in 2029-30, it's nowhere near. And the other side of this, and that's super important, is the NHL conspires to keep those minor league players poor. Okay, it's created this low-cost controlled environment where their movement is restricted intentionally. Okay, their agency is restricted, and that again is the Sean Moore lawsuit. Okay. Now it's interesting too, and this is where I'll end today's lecture, is that whenever there are these labor disputes, the elite players, they look bad for asking more. They lose public support. Players are now perceived as greedy, and we definitely saw that in the last NHL lockout, where they had very little sympathy. And in fact, what happened is we all started watching minor league hockey and loving it. Canadians were really enjoying the Memorial Cup, major junior hockey, senior amateurs as well, the Mann Cup. And they were seen to be more authentic. That was the narrative of the time. This is authentic hockey again. And they absolutely proved that they could really supply what many Canadians wanted. In fact, there was even a movement developed to take the Stanley Cup back from the NHL, to take it away from the NHL, give it back to the amateur teams where it had been in the first place. So yeah, interesting. And that's, yeah, as I said, that's where I want to end it. The shift to corporate capitalism is what we're talking about, the control of the game at that level with the logic of scarcity and with the implications of that, Americanization and all the rest. It has had some benefits, as I talked about in this lecture, but it's come with major costs as well. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got something out of it. Maybe I offended you by saying something you want to challenge me on, and that's awesome. But in any case, thanks for listening. Any questions, let me know.